Today we have Brett Richardson as our guest on the Trophy Chasers interview series. Brett is widely known and respected as an accomplished trophy angler, a top-notch educator on trophy bass behavior, contributor to several well-known fishing publications, and owner of his own Utah-based trophy bass guide service. Brett, thanks for taking the time to talk with us today. It's an honor to have you on.
Oh, glad to talk to you, man. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I know that I've been aware of you for a really long time. I used to read magazines when I was younger and remember seeing your face in there and reading some of your articles. So it's a real pleasure to talk with you and have you take the time and talk with us about your trophy bass chasing career. You've been an author and contributor for several trophy bass fishing magazines and publications over the years. Tell our listeners a little bit about what publications that you've written for and the type of content that you provide for those publications, Brett.
Yeah, I started writing for In Fisherman in 1989 or 90. I was a full-time musician all my life, so my passion was always fishing since I was 3 or 4 years old. So I started writing articles in the 80s and submitting them to local publications, and then got into the In Fisherman Magazine and wrote for them for 24 years. Till the Lindner sold it, and then I still wrote for him for another 5 or 6 years after that. I grew up in the Northeast, but I moved in 2005 to the Southwest, and then started writing for some of the magazines out here. I currently write for Bass Angler Magazine. I'm usually in every issue. There's 4 issues per year, seasonal issues, spring, summer, fall, and winter. So out here where I am, you can actually fish through the winter if you want. Bite's not that great, but you get a few bites, and there's some good-sized fish here, so we have a good time doing that. And I also wrote for Bass West USA, a few articles, plus all my New York publications. Like I said, bass fishing and multi-species fishing for trophy fish has been my passion since I was a young boy, so I'm still doing it today at 66 years old, and still enjoy it just as much. We do a lot of night fishing, of course. I've been doing that since I was super young. Loved to get out and fish topwater when I was like 8, 9 years old. I wouldn't come in until I got at least a 5-pounder in New York and New Jersey. But yeah, it's been a long road. It's been a lot of fun. I fished a lot of lakes across the country and in Canada. Did a lot of Great Lakes fishing for trophy trout, salmon, muskies, walleye, smallmouth, pike. Pretty much covered the whole Northeast and Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and the tributaries.
That's a pretty amazing history that you've got, Brett. And one of the things that always intrigued me is I remember hearing another interview with you where you were talking about how young you were when you started targeting these trophy fish. So for our listeners, how old were you when you took on the mindset to actually target trophy fish rather than just fishing like most kids that age probably would?
I had a passion for it right from the beginning, and by the time I was, 8, 9, 10 years old, I was taking notes on what fish did, and throughout each couple weeks of the season from ice out to ice up in the Northeast, and I'd just make notes on what was going on and followed these fish, and then started fishing offshore structures a lot when I was like 11 or 12, and then started actually guiding on Greenwood Lake, New York when I was like 16 or 17 part-time. Just people saw me catching big fish in deep water, and a lot of the lakes back east, people would just concentrate on, secondary break lines off weeds, and they'd fish shallow structures the entire year, whereas I went offshore as the fish moved and fished offshore structures. So I was getting into a lot bigger fish than people on these commercial lakes that they didn't really think that the big fish existed there anymore. They were there, they just weren't fishing in the right spots to put them in the boat. So I spent years and years just fishing a lot of offshore structures and doing different things than most people to get these fish.
At that age, did you have somebody who was mentoring you and teaching you to follow these fish throughout the season, or is that just something that came natural to you? Tell us a little bit about how that mindset came to be. Was there somebody that you were following or that looked up to that was doing that, or that's just something that you took on and ran with on your own?
Well, at first, I basically started on my own. I tried doing different things. Back then we were using lighter tackle, and late 50s and early 60s, everybody was using Mitchell 300 spinning reels and all the Abu Garcia stuff. And I started fishing different tactics, ripping and dropping spoons, you know, early spinners, until jigs came on the market. Once jigs came on the market, I started jig fishing a lot. But I started basically on my own, trying to figure it out. And then as time went on, of course, I got older, the first magazines that were good were published, like Fishing Facts, the original Fishing Facts magazine. So I got into reading a lot of the early magazines, even before In Fisherman. There was a couple people that I, you know, really had the same kind of mindset, like Buck Perry and some of the early California fishermen. Of course, they were fishing for Florida strain fish. I was fishing for northern strain bass, so a little bit different. Different structures on the East Coast, of course, than the West Coast. But out here, you know, you can fish up to 60, 70 feet for fish. You know, our deepest waters that I fished back east for largemouth and smallmouth, maybe deepest part of the water would be, you know, 70 feet of water. Most lakes, you know, some of them topped out at maybe 40 to 50 feet, some 35 feet. So you had to take each basic body of water and dissect it and then figure out which structures the fish would be on, what kind of structure was in the lake, whether it was heavily reeded wood, offshore rock piles, humps. Each body of water contained different structures back there. So I basically got into doing that. And then as far as learning from magazines, you know, sure, we had a lot of the older trophy bass anglers. Like I said, Buck Perry was one of the guys that I read about first, fishing offshore, and that kind of fit right into what I was doing. So I read a lot of his stuff, and there was a lot of people that I liked in Fishing Facts as far as trophy bass fishing articles back in the day when that first publication came out. So, and then In Fisherman, of course, started, you know, a little later, and I always loved that magazine. I always loved Lindner's and all those guys. So as time went on, I kept reading all the different magazines and then matching it to what I was doing, and learning a little bit from each different angler, and everybody learns from somebody. So that was a big help, you know, taking what they did on their waters and applying them to the waters that I fished.
So, Brett, you lived most of your life in the Northeast. When you moved to Utah in 2005, how hard was that for you to make that adjustment? Was it, I mean, of course the conditions there were going to be different, but was the bass behavior there different, or is it pretty much the same per conditions from one place to the next?
We first moved from northern New Jersey, right on the New York State border there, to Vegas, and we lived in Vegas for 8 years. But I was driving up here to southern Utah to fish anyway, because there was 3 lakes that contained good fish. One lake was new at the time, and it just had opened that spring. So I started fishing up here in the fall of 2005, end of the summer of 2005, on the 3 bodies of water in southern Utah. They're all different as far as structure goes. They're all super deep. The one lake gets up to 230 feet. The main lake that I fish has a lot of rock structure. The fish stay deeper. Even during the pre-spawn, I'll follow migratory fish in from main lake basins just like I did back east, except out here you got, you know, deeper rock ledges. There's some bushes, and there's some desert grass, different type grass that the fish will basically be attracted to at different times of the year. I mean, we'll get out there. The season's different. That was the first thing that stumped me, because I got out here and I decided to day fish in October. So not realizing the water temperatures were as high as they were. Back east, I always night fished right through the first week of October, and then started day fishing. And then, you know, you'd fish through like mid-November, late November back there. Here, different story. I mean, I night fish from March right through. Everybody's day fishing, you know, the early part of the season. I night fish for these fish. The water's super clear on the main reservoir that I fish, so we'll go out night fishing in March when the water temperature is still 48 to 52. Follow the fish in from the main lake basins to the secondary ledges and concentrate on migration routes, basically in deeper water. fish are a little bit spookier. You got to do a lot of dead sticking out here for these fish, but I caught bigger largemouths out here. Now, these are northern strain largemouths in Utah, but they can get pretty big. I mean, in the amount of time that I fished over the last 14 and a half seasons in Utah, we caught more fish over 7 pounds than I did in my entire life in the Northeast. You know, we got 106 fish over 7 pounds, and they top out at about 9.5, 9.25. And those are northern strain. So I mean, those are big northerns, biggest northerns I've seen anywhere for sure.
So what type of presentation are you normally presenting to these northern strain fish? They're using conventional tackle, or do you also throw big swim baits in certain situations, Brett?
Yeah, we do throw swim baits. Most of the time, the largest swim baits I'll throw are 10 inches, but we usually stick to medium-sized swim baits, 6 to 8 inch swim baits. But I mainly get most of my fish, I would say 80% of the trophy fish that I've taken out here have been from deep rock structures and migration routes coming into the pre-spawn, and then as they move out, they'll actually get out into all kinds of different depths here. The deepest water on the main lake that I fish gets up to about 88, 90 feet when it's at full pool. So it's a little bit different in the Northeast. Top water bite. Occasionally it's good. It's not as good as it was in the Northeast, ripping buzz baits over weed beds and topwater baits. And out here it's a little bit different. I get most of my fish on bladed swim jigs and football jigs. You can basically catch them on anything. But as far as just focusing on giant fish, I'd say, 75-80% of my biggest fish were caught on bladed swim jigs or regular bass jigs or football jigs, as opposed to swim baits. I mean, we catch fish on swim baits too. But as far as the overall numbers go, my main productive bait out here has been bladed swim jigs.
It's pretty interesting to me to hear you talk about how deep you guys are fishing out there, because where I'm from here, of course, we fish smaller lakes probably than what you're fishing there. They're TWRA state operated lakes. Usually between 100 and 600 acres is about the size of our lakes here, and I don't think I fish a lake at all that's over 40 feet deep in the main lake basin. So
sure.
So it's a completely different world that you're fishing in out there from what I'm used to. So one of the things that I hear you talk about a lot, Brett, and I've seen you write about this and heard in other interviews, and you've mentioned it a couple of times today already, is the importance of following these giant bass on their migration routes from one season to the next. Can you talk to us a little bit about those migration routes, and how do anglers that have never fished migration routes begin to locate these and understand them, Brett?
Absolutely. What we do here, I did it in the Northeast also, but out here, the lakes are a little bigger. I fish basically the size of lakes that you fish in Tennessee, in northern New Jersey, western New Jersey, and southern New York State, within an hour radius of my old home. In northern New Jersey, there was tons of water to fish. So, I mean, you had Sterling Forest, Harriman State Park, all these different lakes that were like anywhere from 200 to 700 acres, and some even smaller. We had small ponds, and there was just big largemouths all over. Out here, the lakes are 1,300 acres to about 2,500 to 3,000 acres. So, and you got a lot of commercial boat traffic out here, whereas the lakes back home that I fished, I stayed away from the commercial lakes unless I was fishing tournaments back in the 70s when I had time. I was always on the road playing music, but I would go out and fish some of the local tournaments on the commercial lakes too. But I usually took my smaller boats and fished for trophy-sized fish on the smaller bodies of water. So as far as migration routes go on these larger lakes, what you do is get into the main lake basins and just follow the same routes every year that these big fish will take. I mean, you can catch basically on the same cast at the same time of year. For years here, those fish were coming up on the same routes out of the main lake basins and heading for pre-spawn, secondary pre-spawn areas actually in March when the water's still cold, and that's when we got a lot of our big fish. So you'd be fishing anywhere from coming in from the migration route that I'd start to follow it at maybe 48 feet and get all the way up into riprap that's super steep off different dams and embankments, and then the offshore structure stuff, you reverse it. So after the spawn, you're chasing a combination of third round pre-spawners and a bunch of post-spawners that are moving back out onto offshore structure for about a month, and then everything reverts and goes back offshore. So you get out into the middle of the lake and fish these offshore structures. The last couple trips I fished, we were catching fish out of 55 feet of water and into anywhere, probably like shallows would be like 28, 30 feet, and that goes on all summer. And then in fall, our turnover is later than most places in the country. So during turnover, there's a lot of suspended fish. The fish are doing a lot of different stuff like they do in the turnover anywhere in the country. So we'll fish a few different baits. We'll fish the same baits with different variations that time of year. Once it gets into the fall peak bite, then they're just set up on deep structure also. So you can get into I would say, a radius of 200 yards. And when the lake still had a lot of big fish in it, we had nights where we caught 7 trophy fish in 37 minutes off these offshore structures. It was an unbelievable fishery. And people started coming up from Phoenix, coming up from Vegas, coming down from Salt Lake. They come from all over Utah to fish this water, and it gets pounded. You got jet skiers, you got bass boats all over the place. I mean, this place gets 365 days a year of fishing pressure. So between that and all the tournaments that they have here, One Bass, Southern Utah bass anglers, all these different bass groups come in and pound the lake. And, unfortunately, they don't take care of the fish in their live wells. You see people holding up dead fish with opaque eyes in the summer when the water temperature gets hot, because the surface temperature here will get up to about 83 to 88 degrees by midsummer. Our air temperatures, surpass 100 for 4 months in a row, on and off, 95 to 110. So even in a deep body of water like that, it's cooler, of course, because the lake is deep as you fish deeper. As long as there's enough oxygen in certain areas, those fish will get really super deep during the summertime. And in the springtime, basically you're coming in from the deep water on these same migration routes with certain rock structures as these fish come into the secondary pre-spawn areas. Then they'll get up, they'll spawn deeper out here than they do in the Northeast. You got fish that are trying to spawn during ridiculous winds and storm conditions early in the season, which kind of put a damper on it this year for us. We went out there and, one night the wind would be blowing 50 miles an hour. The next night it's blowing 25. So in between that, you get out when it's blowing 25 and try and pull a couple big fish. I ran a bunch of guide trips this year early in the season, put people on some big fish, a couple nights in a row. We had half stable weather, but you never really get the stability that you did in the Northeast for a consistent period of time. So you have to adjust for each weather condition, exactly what's going on. Tons of post-front fishing, a lot of dead sticking. My main tactic as the water gets a little warmer up into the maybe low 50s to high 50s, and throughout the year I do a combination of strolling structures. So I have a lot of DVDs out on different subjects, and a lot of it contains the strolling tactic that I use, running bladed swim jigs over the structure and then dropping it right down to the structure and working it up or down the structure in different directions to get the trigger bites. And then the rest of the year I'm doing a combination of that and casting parallel structures and riprap from 28 to 48 feet of water most of the time.
Got you, Brett. And I'm glad that you mentioned your line of DVDs that you put out. I've personally been able to watch some of those DVDs. They are loaded with a ton of useful information for anybody who's trying to learn to target these trophy bass. You have probably put out more content as far as video content and sharing your knowledge about how to go about targeting these trophy fish, probably more content than any other trophy angler that I know of personally. So those DVDs are just absolutely a fantastic source of information. And what I've learned is, even though the things that you are doing in those DVDs and talking about, they apply to your waters, a lot of that stuff really applies where I live also, and it's things that I probably wouldn't have used in the way that I was targeting fish. I probably never would have used some of those things if it had not been for your DVDs and the information that you shared. So I appreciate that, Brett. How can people go about getting these DVDs? Are they still available? And talk a little bit about your DVD series and what different DVDs that you've put out and how people can go about getting those, Brett.
Sure. I have 18 titles. It took me 10 years to finish. Most of the info pertains to chasing trophy bass anywhere. Of course, when you see me out on the lake, it's southern Utah, and it's, fishing deep structures, but you can apply a lot of the offshore knowledge and all the different things I do to anywhere in the country, even in, smaller waters with a maximum depth of 30 to 40 feet, because the fish will do the same thing. I mean, we catch them, deeper out here. That's just an adjustment on the waters that you fish. But I have 18 titles, starting with early spring, and then I have weather windows for trophy bass, bite windows, which explains the entire bite window time frame change from if you have ice water, during the winter, you got frozen water, it'll apply from ice out right up until ice up again. And I've got spring titles, vertical fishing, post front bass. There's a bunch of spring into summer titles. Then I have 3 summer titles. And then, of course, the double night fishing DVD, which is basically what I do a lot of. And then I have a fall turnover, equations for fall turnover. And then I have 3 fall DVDs, actually. And then I have a winter bassing DVD, which applies to both open water and ice fishing for trophy bass. So there's 18 titles altogether covering, like, every aspect of chasing trophy bass anywhere in the country. So you can apply my strolling methods anywhere in the country with different baits, swim baits, rattle traps, stick baits. I mean, depending on what depth you're fishing, what time of year, there's different tactics on there for everything and different approaches. The bite window thing is really important, and combining bite windows and how they change every 3 weeks throughout the water temperature changes throughout the whole season, and combine that with, like, getting out there right before each moon phase, like a week before the full moon, a week before the new moon, right up until now. The new moon we always fished right through. I did that in New York when I was a kid. Certain times of the year, the new moon bite will be better, and then the full moon is great for the pre-spawn fish because the moon basically pulls these fish in, even if the light factor is bright, which kind of gets weird during the summertime. The new moon's always better during the summertime. It gets so bright out there, you might as well be fishing during the day, except that there's much more boat traffic. But if you combine the correct moon times with water temperature throughout the entire year, and then apply it to the structure that's in your water and where these big fish will be moving throughout each instance, and then you got to put in weather windows, post-front fishing. You have to recognize exactly what's going on when you're on the water and what the trophy fish will be doing, because during the summertime in the warmer water, those big fish, they don't feed as much versus they do before the pre-spawner and the fall peak bite. So basically you're, searching, you got to sacrifice numbers to search for the bigger fish. Although we do get, we'll average, even now with the lake being pounded, we'll average anywhere from 25 to 40 something fish per night anyway. But if you concentrate on the big fish areas for each time of the year, combine that with your moon phases and bite windows. The bite windows change. I mean, there's your dusk bite, which is short. The beginning of the year, it's fine. And then the earlier bite window in the spring is 2 hours earlier than it is during summer, early summer peak, and then it gets later during the summer, and then reverses from the end of the summer to the beginning of fall turnover, and then it gets earlier right through the fall peak.
So to be clear for our listeners who may or may not be familiar with how these bite windows work, I know it's something that I'm still trying to learn more about personally. When you say these bite windows, that's your best bite. Does that apply for all fish, or is that just for the trophy fish you feel like are more affected by those bite windows?
For sure. I mean, there's times of the year when the bite windows actually will work for all size fish, but of course the trophy fish through those bite windows are more active. So basically fish that weren't going to really be active enough to take baits in between the bite windows, you'll be catching smaller to medium sized fish. Once that bite window kicks in throughout the year at different times, that's when you have an actual window to catch the giant fish. On my night fishing DVD, it's all explained, and it's all explained on the bite windows for giant bass DVD. If anybody's interested in any DVDs, just you can email me at brettrtrophyhunter@hotmail.com or check my Facebook page, and you can order them. I still have a good amount left. I've sold a ton of DVDs over the past 10 years, but I still have a decent inventory on all titles, and they'll help you catch fish all year. Throughout everything, there's certain specific times of the summer where you want to fish weather windows in between fronts. That's another really good time to target trophy fish if you can get out in between fronts. As the water is, warming up anywhere from 68 degrees up to whatever the maximum water temperature is on the waters that you fish. Weather windows during the summer are really, really good in between fronts for those big fish. High winds out here actually oxygenate this water, this clear water, and it gets the fish going. We got a lot of crawdads out here, tons of bluegills. There's no rainbow trout in the one lake here. The other lake does get stocked with rainbows every year, but the odd thing about that is people go out there with rainbow trout swim baits and bass wavers and wake baits and don't catch many fish on them as opposed to other methods, which is strange because there's so many rainbows in the lake. Each body of water out here is completely different, just like it is anywhere else, but it's actually harder out here. I would say if somebody came out here and didn't really know what was going on, it would take them a little while to adjust if they fished in different parts of the country.
It is odd that you say that the guys throw the trout swim baits. That's, you hear a lot of the guys in California that are swim bait specific. They talk about how much having those trout stocked changes, how many bass and how big a bass they catch by throwing those trout swim baits. So it's odd that it doesn't work the same way there in Utah where you live.
Oh, it'll work. I mean, you can catch fish on swim baits here too. Big bass wavers, they'll hit them. Just these are northern strain bass as opposed to northern and southern California. Yeah, California is a little bit different because, first of all, they're Florida strain. They're a little bit more timid. You got to get them during, winter trout plantings was always good. A lot of the guys in the 80s, like, say, Bob Krupe, Danny Cadota, the Southern California guys, they did a lot of crawdad fishing during the winter months. So they just dead stick crawdads down there and fish structure, move around a little bit and spend a lot of time on 2 or 3 specific spots per day. And then you got guys that just throw big swim baits specifically. So depending on what lake you fish and how many trophy fish are in the lake, they've always worked well in California. They work well in Northern California. They work well pretty much anywhere in the United States where you got big bass, you can catch them on swim baits. Here, these northern strain fish in the deep water, you'll get 10 times as many bites fishing jigs and bladed swim jigs than you will on a swim bait. These fish will still hit them, but it's not like you're going to go out there and slaughter fish on swim baits, as opposed to California where some of the guys were there during the peaks of those lakes. So just like I fished the peak of this major lake here, some of the lakes in California, a lot of them don't allow night fishing. Some do, some don't, most don't. I don't know about Northern California as far as the hours go in those waters, but, I've got friends in Northern California. I've got people in Southern California that I've known for years. And it's a little bit different. They'll still hit swim baits all over the West Coast. It's been popular for years and years and years. So I remember fishing one of the original swim baits that came out in the 70s, and it was it was like a 4 or 5 inch swim bait with a paddle tail on it, and we used to crush smallmouths on those in the Northeast and largemouth. So out here, I don't use the giant swim baits as much because we don't have Florida strain bass here. I mean, if we had teams fish here, it's a different story. The state record, the official state record in Utah is only 10.4 pounds. And, You know, I've had fish on larger than the recorded state record in the main lake that I fish here when it was at its peak. I've had fish just trash tackle, you know, burn gears out on the Calcutta, just leave take the bait and just leave. You know, I mean, before I started, you know, consistently using 20-pound fluorocarbon instead of 17, these fish will inhale a bait, and these fish are super, super strong. They're like mutant northern strains. They're almost like F1 hybrids. They're super strong. They're fast. They fight like giant smallmouths as the water warms up. They're crazy fish. So it's a little bit different. You got to adjust everywhere in the country that you go. The East Coast is different. Florida is different. I fished in Florida to Maine, and then out in the Midwest, Minnesota. And then I fished in Northern California and Southern California a few times. And they get some big fish up in Washington. The last couple of years they've been getting, you know, nice fish out of the state of Washington. A lot of guys are just fishing steelhead and doing a lot of trout fishing. But there's guys that totally concentrate on trophy bass, and there's a few guys up there that are catching 8 and 9 pounders in Washington, which is nice. A little bit different seasons too. I mean, you know, northern New Jersey and New York State, you know, that water gets cold real fast. The fish shut down pretty quick. You catch them like up till the end of November, but sometimes in November it was freezing. So here it's cooling off now, and then the nights have been actually cooler than they usually are. So the water temperature is going to drop this year a little bit quicker. We're getting kind of sort of October weather already, so it should be a good fall for fish here, but I'll be out fishing offshore structures basically the whole time.
So of all the places that you've gone and fished, Brett, I know you're catching the absolute largest class of bass in your original home state in the Northeast. You have caught countless numbers of fish, and just the biggest class of fish that you could possibly catch in Utah. What is your personal best from anywhere in the United States? What's the biggest bass you've ever caught?
Well, I got a 13.5 in California, and then a year later I got a 15.2. So those are my two biggest teens fish. And then Florida, my biggest fish was 11.9. We caught a couple 8 to 10 pounders down there, but I didn't really spend a ton of time there. I was always up in the Northeast, either on the road playing music. After that, I worked 7 days a week, still played music on weekends, worked for an audio company for 15 years, and then in between was doing all my fishing. So my biggest fish out of the Northeast was an 8.5 pounder, which was ridiculously big for the Northeast. I mean, most of the fish in the Northeast top out at 6 3/4 pounds. And then they're like 15, 16, 17 years old at that point because of the growth rate. And then they just like get skinny and just die. So out here, these fish, with all the warmer temperatures and hot summers, the growing period is longer in this region of the state. Northern Utah is a little bit different, but southern Utah is still hot, so they have a better growing season. They can get a little bigger. There's tons of forage in there, and these are pure northern strength fish. Yeah. And, you know, they can get up over 9 pounds.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen, you know, I go to your YouTube page quite often, Brett, and it's just amazing to me. If you just go through and look at the thumbnails of your videos, I mean, it's just one giant fish after another. And, I mean, those fish, you know, you're looking at, you know, 7, 8, 9s there in Utah. Those fish look extremely big to me. You know, some of those fish, they look bigger than what a 7 or 8 pounder looks to me here in Tennessee. You know, they're shaped different. You know, the East Coast fish look different. They're just giant looking fish, and it's impressive to see, you know, the numbers of big fish that you've put up out there since you've been there. So one question that I always ask anybody that I interview, Brett, is what role does being stealth play in trophy bass fishing, in your opinion? Is that something that you put a lot of focus into, or is that something that you feel is not as big a deal as some guys make it out to be, just being extremely quiet and stealth on the water? What role does that play in your trophy bass fishing?
I always, you know, out here, I basically sold my boats before I moved, and I brought my small boat out for fishing smaller waters. I always like to stay as quiet as possible. Everything affects trophy bass. They get used to, you know, different sounds, you know, even like your depth finder. So, I mean, in the deeper water, they're a little bit less affected as, in shallow water or medium depth water. But as far as being as quiet as possible, I've done that my whole life on both coasts. Chasing trophy fish, you want to be quiet and not make a lot of noise, not bang things in the boat, drop things, like, you know, basically standard knowledge. But it does play a part, and there's a couple combinations of things as far as making noise. And then also when you catch a trophy fish and there's fish grouped up during the pre-spawn, for instance, if you have a live well and you can keep the fish healthy, it's kind of nice to put the fish in the live well, because when you release the fish, of course, they release fear pheromones and they spook the other fish. But I usually just, you know, release my fish, move up a little bit, and if there's a group of fish, I'm usually able to trigger them. On the lake out here, I've had nights where it was unbelievable, where there was just, you know, these big groups of fish when the lake still had them, and you catch like 11 or 12 big fish in an hour. What I'll do is I'll fish one spot, catch a couple fish, move up a little, you know, hit that area, go to another area, let that area rest for an hour and a half, and then go back, and there'll be more fish that moved up during the pre-spawn. So it's pretty cool as far as getting out there and just, you know, focusing on where the fish are. Try not to make a lot of noise and spook them, because they do get spooky, and especially in super clear water. The main two lakes that I fish here are gin clear, and you can see down like 25 feet. It's like some of the Southern California lakes are like that too. I fished on Mission Viejo once, and, you know, there was a lot of teens fishing there, a lot of 8 to 10 pounders, and it was a private lake, and the algae bloom and all those fish died. I had a friend that specifically was trying to break the world record on that lake for years, and I think the biggest fish he got out of there was 17. And that lake was so clear, it was ridiculous. You know, you'd be out there. I only fished it once. I went out there with Troy Folkstead once, and there was fish cruising around, just 10-pounders coming up, picking dining needles off the surface that were post-spawn fish. And then you see these big fish from anywhere from 11, 12, 13 pounds up to 16 pounds plus, just spawning in 25 feet of water on sand. And these guys down there would sight fish. I'm not really big into sight fishing. I never really was. So I knew where the fish were, and they were starting to spawn, but they were still pre-spawn fish. I would go back there at night and just, you know, run a spinnerbait through there or a topwater bait, and they'd come up and crush it or hit a spinnerbait or a jig, you know, 3 baits I basically used back there. But the California fish are a little bit different. Like I said, they're Floridas, they're spooky. And these guys would just go around these lakes and, you know, with sunglasses, staring at the water. Oh, there's one in 25 feet. Here's one in 24 feet. And a lot of these fish would be already, like, in the middle of the spawn, dropping their eggs. So I don't really fish for those fish. So I don't, like, specifically target spawning fish. But a lot of these guys on the West Coast will do that and try and trigger them to bite, where they might get 1 out of 10 or 12 of them to bite right before they're dropping eggs. If they're dropping eggs already, they're focused on it. So 99% of those fish aren't going to, they just get spooked and leave the bed and then circle around and come back. A lot of those guys focus on sight fishing, where I never really got into the sight fishing thing. I was more into the hunt and just, you know, using knowledge to know where the fish were going to be, and then try and trigger them from far away or casting or strolling for them on the migration routes.
Got you, Brett. So if you got a young guy who is just trying to get into trophy bass fishing, hasn't caught his double-digit bass or hasn't caught the biggest class of fish that's available in his body of water, what is the best short-form advice that you could give that would help lead him? Would it be the mindset that it takes, or is there some advice that you would give a guy that was trying to make that adjustment from being just a regular bass angler into being a trophy bass angler?
Sure, there's a big difference from just focusing on numbers and different bait applications, different retrieves for each time of the year throughout the year. So basically, if you're starting out looking for trophy bass, the first thing you want to do is target water that still has the gene pool to harbor trophy bass. You don't want to waste your time on waters where the biggest fish might get up to, like in the Northeast, like we had waters where the biggest fish you might catch out of there would be 4 to 5 pounds, which is still a nice fish in the Northeast. But there's other waters where you had a shot at catching 6.5, 6 3/4, a couple 7 plus, and maybe better. You want to focus, first of all, pick waters that harbor trophy bass, then learn what they're doing each time of the year. Combine that with the weather changes, pre-front, post-front, light windows, moon phases. You got to put the whole thing together and then try and be on the water at those specific times to get the biggest fish in the body of water that you're targeting.
Brett, I got one more question for you.
Sure.
If you could share a boat with any other trophy bass angler, past or present, for a day, who would you want it to be?
That's hard to say, man. There's so many people all over the United States, from back east to Southern California. Most of the people that I know, there's a few that, I respected as trophy bass anglers for the different parts of the country that they fished. I'd be happy to have any of them in my boat. I like to fish with everybody. I take 15-year-old kids out that want to learn trophy bass and guide them. So for me, any of the people that I've known through my lifetime, from the magazines or people I know personally from like In Fisherman and stuff, there's a lot of guys that just, love to catch big fish, whether it be, largemouth, smallmouth, walleye, muskies, whatever. I'd be willing to share the boat or fish with any of the people that are intelligent anglers and seriously searching for trophy fish on the waters, no matter what species it is. As far as bass fishing, there's a lot of people through my lifetime. Like I said, I'll fish with I'd be happy to fish with anybody because I just love to fish. So who's ever in the boat and I'm trying to teach them, if I can learn something from somebody else, great. It helps me, helps everybody. I try and focus on, when I have somebody in the boat, I don't care who it is, I'm trying to put them on fish and watch them have fun. At this age, and been chasing trophy fish all my life, I like to see other people catch fish too. And, I get just as happy when they get a giant fish as when I'm fishing. So, I'd be happy to fish with basically anybody. In the 1970s to 1980, there was a guy who was a complete diehard angler that a lot of guys didn't even know about. And he did an article in Bassmaster in 1980. And he was so dedicated to it. I think that's why he died early. But he was a big influence on my focus. And, being able to, if you have the time, being able to just go out there and stealth it out and burn out on these trophy bass waters until you got one. His name was L.J. Brasher, and he fished in the panhandle of Florida. He lived in Alabama. He owned a transmission shop, and he was fanatical. He would fish all night. All he fished was a musky jitterbug on these smaller alligator and snake infested waters. The little, potholes and stuff. He was crazy. He would go out and fish like the entire night, stay up all day, fish shiners all day, stay out all night again. There was times when, people thought he was dead. He just passed out in the boat, but he was so dedicated to getting these fish at that time in the 70s up to like around 1980. And it was cool to read the article because I go, man, this guy's as crazy as I am. Or he's actually worse because he doesn't care if he dies out there without food and water. You got to have something to eat in the boat and then stay hydrated, especially out in this climate out here. You'll die out here if you don't have water or drinks and stuff. This guy was in like the humid part of the country, a lot of humidity, and he fished different times of the year. He fished basically the whole season. And it's kind of a cool article if you can find it around. It's 1980. I forgot which issue it was. It was like 1980 Bassmaster. There's a whole story on L.J. Brasher. He had all this archaic bait casting with, the old Dacron line, and used the heaviest rod he could find because he was hauling teens fish out of, 8-pound, 9-pound fish up to whatever he got. I think his biggest fish was probably like 14 or something, but that's in Florida. But just, fishing these waters with a lot of, pad cover, stuff like Okeechobee, it's all weeded out, and these fish are like in thick cover. So trying to pull one of them out of there in the middle of the night, he would modify his musky jitterbugs and change the hooks out, bend the lip out to make them sound different. I used to do that with those baits too, and regular jitterbugs. And back in the 60s and 70s, you could catch more fish on a regular Arbogast jitterbug at night. And, as time went on, into the mid-70s when spinnerbait craze went nuts, you would just go out there with a jitterbug and a spinnerbait, and you could catch big fish. It was great. 2 baits, a couple of rigs. That's all you needed. You just need to know where the fish were going to be. But yeah, that guy, I mean, back then I would have loved to like go out there with him, except I probably would have like died from dehydration. But just his commitment alone. There's guys like that through the ages. Like Bill Murphy is one of my favorites. He fished out of a smaller boat and fished offshore structure for years. He invented this stitching technique where you're pulling line in with 2 fingers and fishing 12-inch worms, and he fished all those southern impoundments in California. So he would have been one that I would have loved to fish with and learn from. He died a while back, but his book is still on the market.
I've actually read his book. It changed the way I thought about big bass fishing, to be honest with you.
Yeah, he's one of the guys. I mean, you know, he was older than me, so I was doing the same thing on a different part of the United States, and obviously fishing for smaller fish where I lived, but just to learn, you know, how he did different things. And like I said, Buck Perry in the 40s and 50s and 60s with spoon plugs. You know, he was in North Carolina, and he was fishing the Carolina lakes, and his whole theme, if you read any of Buck Perry's old articles, his whole thing was the big bass live in deep water. That was his motto. And, you know, they'd come in to spawn, but he was fishing the whole year, so he would follow those fish in and out the same way I do and just fish for deep water fish most of the year. And he created that spoon plug, which he used for offshore structure fishing, which was actually, I used those things up on the St. Lawrence River in the 70s for pike and muskies, and that worked just as well. Smallmouths hit them. It's a cool bait. But yeah, there's a lot of guys through the years that just focused on trophy bass. Of course, when you're in a different part of the United States, you want to see giant fish. So you're looking at everybody from California, because that's where the giant Florida strain bass just get super, super fat. They have small heads and giant bodies, and they just attain ridiculous, you know, weight class from eating rainbow trout, crawdads. Around here, it's the same thing. These fish look like the fish in California. I mean, their bodies are like ridiculously big, and their heads are smaller until they get to like 7-8 pounds. Then their heads start getting big again too. But the body weight on these things are incredible. Like you catch, if you call it like say a 3.5 to 5 pound fish here, their bodies are huge, and their heads are smaller than the fish back east. Had big heads and darker coloration. These fish have like really bright markings and a lot of color to them. The scales just shimmer. And they're stronger fish, too. Like I said, they're almost like fighting a giant smallmouth at times. They'll just trash your tackle. They're super, super strong. They got a lot of body weight compared to the fish in the Northeast. Whole different animal. But trophy fish anywhere are a bit different. But it was, you know, for everybody growing up in the era that I grew up in, everybody was reading about like Raymond Easley, the first, 20-pound bass caught in California. Everybody was like, oh, these guys are going to break the world record. And everybody just wanted to read those articles just to look at the fish and see how these guys were catching them. So that was kind of cool. But, when you live in the Northeast, you're like, yeah, I'll never catch a 17-pounder. You got to look at the body of water that you have.
Give us a little bit of information on how people can get in touch with you if they want to come take a guide trip with you. They just contact you through email?
Sure, they can call me direct at 201-362-7363. And they can also contact me on Messenger on my Facebook page, Brett Richardson. You can email me at brettrtrophyhunter@hotmail.com.
We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and sharing your knowledge with us. I'm going to put the information for your Facebook page and your YouTube page. I'll put your email on there. I'll put links to all of that in the description on this interview when it goes up so that people can find you if they want to take a guided trip with you, or if they want to purchase your DVDs on trophy bass fishing, they can do that.
Sure, man. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.